May 21, 1962, a dacha outside Moscow. The air is thick with the scent of spring lilacs and the smoke from Cuban cigars. Inside, a secret meeting is underway that will bring the world closer to nuclear Armageddon than at any other time in human history. Nikita Khrushchev, the brash, boisterous premier of the Soviet Union, gathers his most trusted advisors: Defense Minister Rodion Malinovsky, Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko, and Anastas Mikoyan. He paces the floor, jabbing a finger in the air for emphasis. He has a plan so audacious, so secret, that it will forever alter the balance of power on the planet. He calls it Operation Anadyr. Anadyr is a desolate, frozen river in the farthest reaches of Siberia. The name was chosen for a reason: deception. Because the thousands of men and the city-killing arsenal they were about to move weren't going to the Arctic. They were going to the tropics, to the sun-drenched island of Cuba, just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. From the Kremlin's perspective, the move was not just a masterstroke, it was a necessity. For years, Khrushchev had fumed as the United States ringed his country with nuclear weapons. American Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy, medium-range ballistic missiles, could strike Moscow in less than 16 minutes. He later wrote in his memoirs, "The Americans had surrounded our country with military bases, and now they would learn just what it feels like to have enemy missiles pointing at you." Then there was Cuba. The failed American-backed Bay of Pigs invasion a year earlier had convinced Khrushchev that the Americans were obsessed with crushing Fidel Castro's communist revolution. Placing Soviet troops and nuclear weapons on the island would be the ultimate guarantee of its sovereignty. It was the perfect shield. But the real prize was strategic checkmate. The Soviet Union was lagging dangerously behind in the missile race. While they had powerful warheads, their long-range ICBMs were few in number and unreliable. They couldn't guarantee a devastating strike on the United States. But by placing shorter-range, proven missiles in Cuba, Khrushchev could leapfrog the technology gap in a single move. Dozens of American cities, from Washington, D.C. to Dallas, would suddenly be held under a 5-minute nuclear threat. He was moving his queen right up to the enemy's king. The secrecy was absolute, bordering on paranoia. The plan was known to less than a dozen men in the entire USSR. The 50,000 Soviet soldiers assigned to the mission were issued skis, parkas, and fleece-lined boots. They were told they were heading to a cold, remote eastern post. On board the transport ships, the holds were poorly ventilated, and the men sweltered in the tropical heat, still unaware of their true destination until they were well out to sea. The cargo manifests were a masterwork of disinformation. The R-12 and R-14 nuclear missiles, capable of carrying multi-megaton warheads, were listed as agricultural equipment and irrigation machinery. The nuclear warheads themselves traveled on different ships, their crates marked with indecipherable symbols. Dozens of civilian freighters began to plow their way across the Atlantic, riding high in the water on their way to Cuba and sitting dangerously low on the return, a detail that would later attract the suspicion of a few sharp-eyed analysts. Khrushchev was utterly convinced his gamble would work. He believed the Americans were too arrogant, too complacent to notice. He envisioned the operation completing in total secrecy. Then, in November, perhaps during a grand address to the United Nations, he would reveal his hand. He would announce to a stunned world that the strategic balance had shifted. The Soviet Union now had a nuclear dagger pressed to America's throat. The Americans, he told his inner circle, would have no choice but to swallow this hedgehog, quills, and all. But Khrushchev's grand strategy, his entire conception of a secret checkmate, was built on a foundation of sand. He was playing a three-dimensional game of nuclear chess, but he was blind to the fourth dimension, altitude. He believed he was operating under a cloak of secrecy, but for years, the United States had been developing a capability that rendered traditional secrecy almost meaningless. It wasn't a network of spies or a code-breaking machine. It was an aircraft, a machine so advanced, so otherworldly, that it was more a powered glider from the edge of space than a conventional airplane. It was the Lockheed U-2, affectionately and fearfully known as the Dragon Lady. This was the American counter-reality. While Khrushchev plotted in his dacha, trusting in jungle canopies and falsified shipping manifests, America had an eye in the sky. The U-2 was the brainchild of the legendary Skunk Works genius Kelly Johnson. It was designed to do one thing: fly higher than any Soviet fighter or surface-to-air missile could possibly reach. Cruising at over 70,000 feet, 13 miles up, the pilot was, for all intents and purposes, an astronaut, wearing a full-pressure suit, breathing pure oxygen. From that silent, frozen perch at the edge of the atmosphere, the U-2 carried a payload that was arguably more powerful than any missile, the A-2 camera. A marvel of optical engineering, it could photograph a strip of land 125 miles wide and 3,000 miles long on a single roll of film. The resolution was so astonishingly precise that photo interpreters back on the ground could distinguish an object the size of a shoebox from 13 miles away. They could count the players on a baseball diamond, and they could, with chilling certainty, identify the unique star-shaped layout of a Soviet SAM missile site, or the telltale concrete launch pads of an R-12 nuclear missile battery. Khrushchev's confidence was a relic of a bygone era. He believed that what couldn't be seen by a spy on the ground was a secret kept. The Soviet premier, the man who held the fate of the world in his hands, had fatally underestimated a technology he did not fully comprehend. His secret deployment, his brilliant hedgehog, was about to be photographed in stunning, undeniable detail. The game of ghosts was over. The U-2 was about to turn Khrushchev's covert gambit into the most public, most terrifying nuclear standoff in the history of mankind. To understand the sheer world-altering power of the U-2, we have to rewind the clock. Back to the mid-1950s, a time when the Iron Curtain wasn't just a political barrier, it was an intelligence black hole. For President Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Soviet Union was a vast, unknowable land of shadows. American intelligence could intercept radio chatter, cultivate low-level agents, and study military parades in Red Square. But this was like trying to understand the ocean by looking at a single glass of water. The real questions, the ones that kept Eisenhower and the Joint Chiefs of Staff awake at night, were terrifyingly simple. How many long-range bombers did the Soviets have? Where were their factories? And most importantly, how far along was their ballistic missile program? Wild estimates, fueled by scraps of information and political fear-mongering, gave rise to the specter of the bomber gap, and later, the missile gap. The fear was that the Soviets were secretly building a massive nuclear force, an armada of bombers and rockets that could overwhelm the United States in a surprise first strike. The pressure on Eisenhower to act, to build more of everything, was immense. But Ike, the calculating old general, refused to govern by guesswork. He despised the idea of a blind, runaway arms race. He famously said he wanted to prevent another Pearl Harbor, but he needed facts. He needed to see inside the black box. In 1954, Eisenhower called together a panel of the nation's brightest scientific minds. Their conclusion was radical. They proposed building a dedicated high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft, a plane that could fly so high it would be untouchable. The project was given the codename Aquatone and handed not to the Air Force, who proposed a large, complex, and slow design, but to the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA, in turn, knew there was only one man who could build the impossible: Clarence Kelly Johnson, the mercurial head of Lockheed's Advanced Development Projects, the Skunk Works. The Skunk Works was a place of legend, a secretive engineering cathedral where a small, hand-picked team worked miracles on impossible deadlines. Johnson's motto was, "Be quick, be quiet, and be on time." He promised the CIA he could deliver an aircraft that could fly to 70,000 feet with a range of 3,000 miles. He promised to do it in just 8 months. He delivered. The result was the U-2. On the ground it looked awkward, almost fragile. It had the sleek, impossibly long wings of a glider stretching over 80 feet, designed to generate immense lift in the thin, cold air of the stratosphere. It was powered by a single, specially modified Pratt and Whitney J57 engine. To save weight, Johnson made the skin out of thin aluminum, stripped out the ejection seat on early models, and designed a bicycle landing gear where the pilot had to physically drop the wingtip wheels, or pogos, during takeoff. Flying it was a master class in concentration. Pilots called the flight envelope at altitude the coffin corner. At 70,000 feet, the margin between the speed at which the U-2 would stall in the thin air and the speed at which it would break apart from air resistance was a razor-thin 10 knots. A moment's inattention, a slight dip of the nose, and the delicate airframe could disintegrate. The pilots were encased in bulky pressure suits, breathing 100% oxygen for hours, eating liquefied food out of tubes, alone with the curvature of the Earth and the deep black of space above. On July 4, 1956, American Independence Day, pilot Hervey Stockman flew the first U-2 over the Soviet Union, soaring high above Leningrad and Moscow. The effect on the Soviets was one of pure, impotent rage. Their primitive radar systems could see the aircraft, a tiny, ghostly blip crawling across their screens at an impossible altitude. They scrambled their best MiG fighters, which clawed their way upwards, only to have their engines flame out in the oxygen-starved air, tens of thousands of feet below the intruder. Khrushchev and his generals could do nothing but watch as this American ghost violated their sovereign airspace with impunity, photographing their most sensitive military and industrial sites. For 4 years, the Dragon Lady was America's untouchable angel. Its cameras systematically dismantled the bomber gap, proving the Soviets had far fewer long-range bombers than feared. It mapped their airfields, their submarine pens, and their nuclear testing sites at Semipalatinsk. It gave Eisenhower the hard data he needed to resist the calls for a massive, panicked military buildup. This era of invincibility came to a screeching halt on May 1, 1960. While flying a deep penetration mission, CIA pilot Francis Gary Powers was shot down over Sverdlovsk, not by a fighter, but by a barrage of new high-altitude SA-2 guideline surface-to-air missiles. The shoot-down was a massive international incident, humiliating the United States and giving Khrushchev a huge propaganda victory. The psychological impact on Washington was profound. Eisenhower was forced to cancel all U-2 overflights of the Soviet Union. When John F. Kennedy came to office, that prohibition remained. This created a dangerous new reality. The eye in the sky had been partially blinded, and it was in this shadow, this renewed period of American uncertainty, that Nikita Khrushchev developed his fatal overconfidence. He believed the SA-2 missile had permanently checked the threat of the U-2. He was convinced that what he was about to do in Cuba would be shielded by his new missile defenses and America's newfound caution. He assumed the Dragon Lady was a threat he no longer needed to fear. It was the single greatest miscalculation of the Cold War. As the summer of 1962 baked Washington, D.C., a slow, creeping anxiety began to settle over the American intelligence community. The direct, undeniable evidence from U-2 overflights of the USSR was gone, but the game of ghosts had not stopped. It had simply shifted to the shadows. Analysts at the CIA's headquarters in Langley, Virginia, were working with a blizzard of fragmented, often contradictory intelligence. It started as a trickle. Whispers from Cuban refugees in Miami spoke of strange military convoys moving through the countryside at night. Rumors circulated of soldiers who spoke Russian or German, men who kept to themselves and didn't look or act like Cubans. These were just rumors, easily dismissed as exile chatter. But then the harder intelligence began to arrive. Signals intercepts picked up new and unusual electronic emissions from the island. Shipping analysts, poring over manifests and photographs of vessels entering Cuban ports, noted a dramatic spike in Soviet bloc freighters. One analyst, with a particularly keen eye, noticed the odd detail that so many ships making the long, expensive voyage to Havana were returning empty, riding high in the water. What cargo were they delivering that required no Cuban goods in return? The most alarming signs came from the ground. By September, the CIA had multiple human sources reporting the arrival of a new defensive weapon system. They described long canvas-covered trucks, cylindrical objects, and a unique Star of David or six-pointed star pattern of vehicles and equipment. To the trained eye of a photo interpreter or an arms analyst, that pattern meant only one thing: the SA-2 guideline, the very same surface-to-air missile that had brought down Gary Powers. This was a major escalation. The presence of SA-2s meant the Soviets were building a sophisticated, integrated air defense network around Cuba. But to defend what? Castro's aging air force? The island's sugar refineries? The official explanation from Moscow, delivered with a straight face by Ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin to the president's brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, was that all military aid to Cuba was purely defensive in nature. In the White House and the Pentagon, this was seen as a worrying but not yet catastrophic development. The consensus was that the Soviets were shoring up their Cuban ally against another potential American invasion. It was a line Khrushchev would never cross to place offensive weapons, nuclear missiles, in the Western Hemisphere. It was too risky, too provocative. It defied all logic. But one man wasn't buying it. John McCone, a dour Republican businessman whom Kennedy had appointed as Director of Central Intelligence, had a gut feeling that something was deeply wrong. McCone was on his honeymoon in the south of France, but he was being fed a steady diet of intelligence cables. He saw the SA-2 sites not as a shield for Cuba, but as a screen being erected to hide something far more sinister being assembled behind it. He fired off a series of increasingly urgent memos to the White House. In one, dated August 22nd, he laid out his chilling hypothesis. The installation of SA-2 sites in Cuba is puzzling, unless the Soviets intend to deploy offensive ballistic missiles. The presence of the SAMS is to protect the offensive missile sites during their construction. His warnings were largely dismissed. The wise men of Kennedy's administration, including Secretary of State Dean Rusk and National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, saw McCone as an alarmist. The prevailing view, what analysts call groupthink, had settled in. They concluded Khrushchev was a rational actor. He would never be so reckless. They assured President Kennedy that placing nuclear missiles in Cuba was a fantasy. But the intelligence fragments kept coming. On September 21st, a key CIA source, a trusted agent inside the Cuban government codenamed Lash, reported seeing a trailer carrying a beheaded torpedo, 60 feet long, near the San Cristobal area in western Cuba. The description was a near-perfect match for a Soviet R-12 medium-range ballistic missile. The pressure was building. The intelligence was pointing to a conclusion that was strategically and politically unthinkable. The whispers were becoming a roar. Kennedy could no longer afford to be blind. The risk of another shoot-down, the political embarrassment, the potential for escalation, all of it now paled in comparison to the risk of John McCone being right. The president and his advisors had to look. They had to know for sure. On October 9th, the Committee on Overhead Reconnaissance, a top-secret group that authorized all spy flights, met in quiet desperation. They formally approved a U-2 mission over western Cuba, specifically targeting the areas where the troubling reports were originating. The mission was codenamed Bull Run. Due to inter-service rivalries and political sensitivities after the Powers incident, the flight would not be flown by a CIA pilot. It would be an Air Force pilot from the 4080th Strategic Reconnaissance Wing. The man chosen for the flight was Major Richard Steve Heiser. He was told the mission was to confirm the presence of SAM sites. No one mentioned the word missile. No one wanted to believe it themselves. In the pre-dawn darkness of October 14, 1962, at Edwards Air Force Base in California, Major Heiser squeezed into his claustrophobic pressure suit. He breathed pure oxygen for an hour, purging the nitrogen from his blood. Then he climbed the ladder into the cockpit of U-2F, tail number 56-6676. After a long, delicate takeoff roll, he banked the great glider east, then southeast, climbing into the blackness. His flight path would take him down over the Gulf of Mexico, making landfall over the western tip of Cuba, the Pinar del Rio province. He was a single man in a fragile machine flying towards a chain of Caribbean islands. But in reality, he was flying towards the epicenter of a geopolitical earthquake, armed with nothing but a camera, on his way to find Khrushchev's hedgehog. High above the Cuban coast, Major Heiser was a navigator in a sea of blue and black. His altitude was a staggering 72,500 feet, nearly 14 miles up. Below him, the SA-2 SAM sites he had been warned about were a very real threat. He knew that if their radar locked onto him, a Soviet-made missile could climb into the thin air and swat him from the sky just as it had Gary Powers. His mission was a high-speed, high-stakes ballet, a 6-minute dash across the island's western tip. Heiser's hands, steady inside his bulky gloves, worked the controls. His primary job was not to fly the plane, but to guide the camera. In the belly of the U-2, the A2 camera system hummed to life. With its massive 36-inch focal-length lens, it began its work. The camera's shutter clicked open and closed with mechanical precision, exposing section after section of a roll of film nearly 2 miles long. For 6 terrifying minutes, as he flew from south to north over the San Cristobal area, the U-2 captured 928 individual photographic frames, each one a potential key to unlocking Khrushchev's secret. He banked the plane out over the Gulf of Mexico and headed for home, landing at a forward operating base in Florida. The mission clock was still ticking. The moment the U-2's wheels touched down, a dedicated team rushed the aircraft. They didn't care about the pilot or the plane, they cared about the payload. They carefully removed the precious film canisters, packed them in specially marked containers, and loaded them onto a waiting courier jet. The film, holding what was potentially the most explosive secret in the world, was flown immediately to Washington, D.C. Its destination was a nondescript building in a part of the city called Foggy Bottom. This was the headquarters of the National Photographic Interpretation Center, or NPIC. It was here, in sterile, brightly lit rooms, that the Cold War's most important battles were often won or lost, not with bullets, but with light tables, stereoscopes, and the razor-sharp eyes of trained photo interpreters. The film from Heiser's flight arrived late on Monday, October 15th. The NPIC team worked through the night. The long rolls of film were developed, dried, and spooled. Analysts, working in pairs, hunched over their light tables. They unrolled the film frame by frame, peering through powerful magnifying stereoscopes that turned the flat, two-dimensional images into a three-dimensional landscape. It was a grueling, painstaking process. They were searching a vast area of Cuban jungle and farmland for telltale signs, for anything out of the ordinary. They were looking for the pattern of a SAM site, a new airfield, anything. For hours, they found nothing but trees and fields. Then, late in the afternoon, an analyst working on a section near San Cristobal stopped cold. He called his supervisor over. On the illuminated film, clear as day, was a scene that made the blood run cold. It wasn't the six-pointed star of a defensive SAM site. This was something else, something they had been trained to recognize from U-2 photos of the Soviet Union, but had prayed they would never see 90 miles from American soil. There, parked in a clearing carved out of the forest, were several long, canvas-covered trucks. Beside them were missile erectors, fuel bowsers, and tent-like structures for the launch crews. Most damning of all were the concrete launch pads being hastily constructed. An experienced analyst, Dino Brugioni, was brought in. He took one look and confirmed the team's worst fears. "This isn't a SAM site," he declared. "This is a medium-range ballistic missile site, an R-12. The room fell silent. The evidence was undeniable. Khrushchev hadn't just sent defensive weapons. He had lied. He was secretly installing nuclear-capable offensive missiles in Cuba, missiles that could strike Washington, D.C., the Panama Canal, and the Strategic Air Command headquarters in Omaha. The flight time would be a matter of minutes. America's nuclear deterrent, its entire strategic warning system, was about to be rendered obsolete. The analysts quickly scanned the rest of the film from Heiser's flight. They found more. A second medium-range ballistic missile site nearby, then a third. It was a full-blown deployment. The geopolitical dynamite had been found. A frantic top-secret report was compiled. The key photographs were enlarged, annotated, and placed in briefing folders. By 8:30 p.m. that evening, a CIA officer hand-carried the folder to the White House. He didn't go to the president. Kennedy was home, having dinner, completely unaware that the world had fundamentally changed in the last few hours. The officer delivered the package to the National Security Advisor, McGeorge Bundy. Bundy, a cool, intellectual Boston Brahmin, opened the folder. He stared at the images. He read the chilling, unequivocal analysis. He understood instantly that this was a crisis of a magnitude never before faced by any American president. His advisors urged him to wake the president immediately, but Bundy made a calculated decision. Nothing could be done at that moment. Waking the president in the middle of the night would only risk panic and premature decisions. The secret, for a few more hours, would be held by a tiny circle of men. So, as the city of Washington slept on the night of October 15, 1962, a ticking nuclear time bomb lay on McGeorge Bundy's desk. The proof of Khrushchev's ultimate deception was locked away, waiting for the sun to rise on what would become the first day of the most dangerous standoff in human history. The President of the United States was about to wake up and learn that he was in a game of nuclear checkmate. Tuesday, October 16, 1962, 8:45 a.m., the White House. McGeorge Bundy walked into President John F. Kennedy's private quarters in the residence, the explosive intelligence folder in his hand. He found the president in his pajamas, reading the morning papers. "Mr. President," Bundy began, his voice grim, "there is something you need to see." He opened the folder and laid the stark black and white photographs on the breakfast table. He pointed to the annotated images, the missile transporters, the erectors, the launch pads. "We have photographic proof," he said, "of Soviet ballistic missiles in Cuba." Kennedy stared at the pictures. The casual morning routine shattered. The blood drained from his face. According to his brother Robert, who was there moments later, the president's reaction was one of stunned, seething anger, not just at the strategic threat, but at the personal betrayal. For months, Soviet officials, from Ambassador Dobrynin to Foreign Minister Gromyko, had looked him directly in the eye and lied. They had assured him, repeatedly and categorically, that no offensive weapons would ever be placed in Cuba. Khrushchev had played him for a fool. The crisis had begun. Kennedy's first order was for absolute secrecy. If the American public, or worse, the press, found out about the missiles before he had a plan, the panic and political pressure for a massive, immediate military strike would become unstoppable. He canceled his scheduled campaign trips, feigning a head cold, and quietly assembled a hand-picked group of his most senior advisors. This ad hoc committee would become known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or ExComm. It was a collection of the most powerful men in the nation, gathered in the utmost secrecy in the cabinet room. There was the hawkish chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Maxwell Taylor, the cool, analytical Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, the steady Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, the President's fiercely loyal brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, and a dozen others. For the next 13 days, these men would hold the fate of the world in their hands. The initial meetings were fraught with shock and a raw desire for retaliation. The military chiefs were nearly unanimous. The solution was clear, direct, and overwhelming. A massive series of airstrikes to wipe the missile sites off the map, followed by a full-scale invasion of Cuba to remove Castro once and for all. General Curtis LeMay, the cigar-chomping, fire-breathing head of the Air Force, argued that anything less was appeasement. He saw the Soviet move as a gross act of aggression that demanded a sharp, quick, decisive military response. To him, a blockade was almost as bad as the appeasement at Munich. The arguments were compelling. The missiles presented an imminent and unacceptable threat. Every hour that passed was an hour the Soviets used to make those missile sites operational. The U-2 flights, now flying almost constantly, provided terrifying daily updates. More sites were being discovered, not just the R-12 medium-range missiles, which had a range of about 1,200 miles, but evidence of R-14 intermediate-range missile sites under construction. These could travel over 2,400 miles, putting nearly the entire continental United States, save for the Pacific Northwest, under the nuclear gun. The analysts at NPIC estimated that once operational, the combined missile force could launch over 80 nuclear warheads, killing 80 million Americans in minutes. The pressure on Kennedy to unleash the full might of the U.S. military was immense. But the president hesitated. He was haunted by the Bay of Pigs fiasco and the bad advice he had received from his military and intelligence chiefs. He began to probe, to question their certainty. He asked LeMay, "If we attack, can you guarantee you'll get all the missiles?" The answer was a chilling no. The Air Force could promise to destroy 90% of them, but some would almost certainly survive. And what would happen then? Robert Kennedy articulated the group's deepest fear. If American bombs rained down on Cuba, killing thousands of Soviet soldiers working at the sites, how would Khrushchev react? Would he stand by and accept the humiliation? Or would he retaliate? Would he seize West Berlin, plunging Europe into war? Or, in a final act of desperation, would he launch the few missiles that survived the airstrike against an American city? The president's brother put it in stark moral terms, scribbling a note to JFK during one heated debate. "I now know how Tojo felt when he was planning Pearl Harbor." An unannounced surprise air attack felt like a betrayal of American values. As the days of secret debate wore on, the consensus slowly shifted. Kennedy began to favor a less direct but still forceful option. Instead of an attack, a quarantine. A naval blockade around Cuba to prevent any more offensive weapons from arriving. It was a strong, clear signal of American resolve, but it wasn't a direct act of war. It put the next move, the next decision to escalate, squarely back on Nikita Khrushchev. It bought time. It left the door open for a diplomatic solution, however slim. While ExComm debated in secret, the world went on, oblivious. The U.S. military, however, began to move. In the largest, quietest military mobilization since World War II, troops and aircraft poured into Florida. The Navy dispatched 180 warships to the Caribbean. Strategic Air Command put its fleet of B-52 bombers on airborne alert, flying 24/7, ready to strike the Soviet Union on a moment's notice. The DEFCON level, the defense readiness condition, was raised to 3. The world was being moved to the brink of nuclear war, and almost no one knew it. The secret could not hold for much longer. On the evening of October 22, 1962, the secret was finally revealed to the world. At 7 p.m. Eastern Time, President John F. Kennedy sat at the resolute desk in the Oval Office and addressed the American people and the world. His speech was one of the most chilling broadcasts in human history.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
Across the nation, life came to a standstill. Families gathered around their television sets in disbelief. Kennedy laid out the undeniable proof provided by the U-2 flights and announced his decision: a strict naval quarantine around Cuba to take effect on the morning of October 24th. He made the stakes terrifyingly clear. Any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere would be regarded as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response. The world held its breath. Panic buying emptied grocery store shelves, churches filled with people praying, school children practiced duck and cover drills, with a terrifying new urgency. The game of ghosts was over. The nuclear standoff was now public, and the two most powerful men on Earth were locked in a terrifying test of will. The first flashpoint came on Wednesday, October 24th, as Soviet freighters steamed towards the American quarantine line. In the White House Situation Room, the tension was unbearable. A U.S. Navy destroyer, the USS Essex, reported it was tracking two Soviet ships, the Gagarin and the Kamiles, approaching the line. With them was a Soviet submarine. Secretary of State Dean Rusk, watching the plot board, leaned over to McGeorge Bundy and uttered the now immortal line, "We're eyeball to eyeball," and I think the other fellow just blinked. Word came in that the Soviet ships had stopped dead in the water, just miles from the quarantine line. In Moscow, Khrushchev, faced with the undeniable reality that his secret was out and the Americans were willing to go to war over it, had pulled back from the brink. It was a moment of profound relief, but the crisis was far from over. The missiles were still in Cuba, and the work to make them operational was continuing at a frantic pace. The most dangerous day of the crisis, what history now calls Black Saturday, was October 27th. A series of events, any one of which could have triggered Armageddon, unfolded with terrifying speed. A U-2 on a routine air sampling mission near the North Pole accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace, causing the Soviets to scramble MiG fighters and the U.S. to scramble nuclear-armed F-102 interceptors to protect it. For a terrifying half hour, a dogfight over the Arctic could have started World War III. Then, the news that XCOM had dreaded from the beginning. Another U-2, piloted by Air Force Major Rudolph Anderson, flying a reconnaissance mission over Cuba, was hit. A Soviet-manned SA-2 missile battery, acting on the orders of a local commander and without permission from Moscow, fired a salvo. Anderson's plane was struck and disintegrated at 70,000 feet. He was killed instantly, the only combat casualty of the crisis. In the cabinet room, the news landed like a physical blow. The Hawks were vindicated. The Soviets had fired first. They had killed an American pilot. The pressure on Kennedy to retaliate, to order the airstrikes scheduled for the following Monday, was almost unbearable. The war plans were on the table. The invasion was ready. The world was now just one presidential order away from nuclear war. But in the midst of this chaos, a desperate secret back channel had opened. 2 letters had arrived from Khrushchev. The first was long, rambling, and emotional, offering to remove the missiles in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba. The second, more formal letter added a new demand: the removal of American Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Kennedy, in a stroke of genius, chose to ignore the second, more difficult letter and respond only to the first. He sent his brother Robert to a secret meeting with Ambassador Dobrynin. RFK delivered the public deal. The Soviets would remove the missiles under UN inspection, and the U.S. would publicly pledge not to invade Cuba. But then he added a secret sweetener, a verbal promise known to only a handful of men. He told Dobrynin that the Jupiter missiles in Turkey were obsolete and would be removed anyway in a few months, but this could never be part of a public trade. It had to be a secret understanding. It was the way out both men desperately needed. On the morning of Sunday, October 28th, Radio Moscow broadcast a message from Nikita Khrushchev. He announced that he had ordered the dismantling of the missile sites in Cuba and their return to the Soviet Union. The crisis was over. In the end, Khrushchev's grand, secret gambit was shattered by a single technological capability he had fatally underestimated. The U-2 spy plane didn't just provide intelligence, it provided the truth. It stripped away the lies, the deception, and the disinformation, and presented the Kennedy administration with an undeniable reality. It turned what Khrushchev intended as a fait accompli into a negotiation. Years later, in his memoirs, Nikita Khrushchev would reflect on the crisis. While he would always frame it as a victory for peace and the defense of Cuba, his words betray a clear concession. He admitted that his fundamental assumption that he could install the missiles in secret was his undoing. He wrote, "We knew that the Americans kept our country, and Cuba too, under constant surveillance from the sky. We had to try to install the missiles without their detecting them. It was a great risk. If our shipments had been discovered at sea, the United States would have been able to stop us. But we calculated that we could get the missiles to Cuba and install them before the United States found out. He calculated wrong. He gambled on secrecy in an age when the eye in the sky was making true secrecy obsolete. The Dragon Lady, the angel on America's shoulder, had flown to the edge of space and seen the truth. The photographs taken by Major Heiser on October 14th did not cause the Cuban Missile Crisis. They revealed it. They gave a young president the one thing he needed most in the face of nuclear blackmail: unimpeachable evidence. And in doing so, that fragile glider and the brave men who flew it may very well have saved the world.